Welcome, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for this important conversation. Today's discussion is the first in a new series sponsored by the Berkeley Center on Rethinking Religion and Human Rights, which is designed to help revive the revolutionary idea behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, both to buttress the normative case for human rights and to elucidate how achieving universal respect for human rights requires not only legal rules and duties, but a wider engagement with cultural norms and collective action and morality and movement building and an examination of the role of religious communities and other social movements. Our focus in today's event aims to connect human rights discourse with broader moral, political, and economic discussions of poverty and inequality. There is perhaps no social phenomenon more comprehensive in its assault on human rights than poverty. Poverty undermines not only the universal rights to health, to housing, food, water, and education, but it also impedes the exercise of civil and political rights, like the right to political participation, to a fair trial, and personal security. According to the UN Development Programme's Human Development Report, 2019, more than 1.3 billion people around the world are living in what's called multidimensional poverty, a measure of poverty that looks beyond daily income to encompass the interlocking deprivations facing the poor. Here in the United States, 2020 marked the first increase in poverty after 5 years of decrease, bringing the national total of people living in poverty to 37.2 million. The ongoing global pandemic, with its outsized impact on the poor and marginalized, risks making this reversal a trend, not only in the United States, but around the world. Now, given its profound impact on human dignity and security, it's no surprise that the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by UN member states in 2015 listed the eradication of poverty by 2030 as job number one. But recognition of the devastating impact poverty has on the exercise of human rights is not a new thing. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights affirms that, quote, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. That's Article 25. How should governments, civil society groups, and the human rights movement more broadly operationalize this imperative to lift the burden of poverty? What new strategies can we pursue to prevent the magnifying effect of the pandemic on poverty? And how should we account for the gender and racial dynamics of poverty? In this session today, we'll explore these and related questions and set the stage for a series of discussions around the impact of poverty on a range of human rights. Now, before I introduce our distinguished panel of speakers, we have a quick 2-minute video courtesy of the Center for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that will help frame our discussion. So please take a look. Looks like we need sound. Let's try that one more time.
What would our world look like if we prioritize people and planet, not profit and plunder? What if we designed our economies to guarantee human rights for all? Right now, our economic system works to benefit the few, not the many, to empower corporations, not communities. But what if we did things differently? What comes to mind when you think of human rights? Dignity, equity, justice? Our economies can make it easier or harder to achieve these things. Shaped by decades of struggle by activists around the world, human rights entitle every person to the conditions they need to flourish. Why is talking about rights important? Because when something is a right, it means it is too fundamental to be left to the arbitrary choices of public officials or to the whims of the unregulated market. It's a public good governments must protect, not a privilege or a commodity. In this way, centering human rights directly challenges our current market-driven, corporate-dominated economic model. That's why we're creating a vision for a rights-based economy. In a rights-based economy, success would mean providing a dignified life for all people and dismantling inequality, fostering solidarity instead of competition between individuals and between countries, respecting planetary boundaries and working in harmony with nature, advancing economic and environmental justice on a global scale and redressing historical wrongs. Armed with a progressive vision based on human rights, we can build a new, fairer economic system in the wake of COVID-19. If you want wealthy people and powerful corporations to pay their fair share, if you think care work should be valued and supported rather than taken for granted, if you demand living wages for all and public services in public hands, join us. Read the report by the Centre for Economic and Social Rights and Christian Aid and help us to build a blueprint for a rights-based economy.
Great, that's so powerful. I'm Elisa Massimino. I'm the Executive Director of the Human Rights Institute at Georgetown University Law Center. And I'm so excited about this conversation we're going to have today. One of the reasons I wanted you all to see that short film is because, having worked in the human rights movement for 30 years myself, I know that we often get deeply mired in admiring the problems that we face. And that short video, I think, is a good reminder that while we need to understand the problem, we really need to be able to describe the vision of the future that we want, so we can figure out the path to get there. And that's part of the conversation that we're going to have today. We have a really terrific lineup for this conversation. Let me introduce them now. Kate Donald, who you saw in the video, is Acting Executive Director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights, where since 2014, she has led the organization's work on economic policy, on sustainable development goals, and on women's human rights. The Center for Economic and Social Rights works across 5 continents, harnessing the power of human rights to inspire fairer and more sustainable economies. Before joining the Center for Economic and Social Rights, Kate worked for the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights and for the International Council on Human Rights Policy. My colleague at Georgetown, David Hollenbach, is Pedro Arrupe Distinguished Research Professor in the Walsh School of Foreign Service and a Senior Fellow with me at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, where David teaches social ethics. David's research deals with religious and ethical responses to humanitarian crises and refugees, human rights, theories of justice and religion in political life. His approach is shaped by Catholic social thought, theology, moral philosophy, and the social sciences. He's written several books on these subjects, most recently, Humanity in Crisis, Ethical and Religious Responses to Refugees. David has served as president of the Catholic Theological Society of America and the Society of Christian Ethics, and he was instrumental in drafting Economic Justice for All, Catholic Social Teaching and the U.S. Economy, a pastoral letter of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Rob Robinson is formerly homeless community organizer and activist based in New York City. Rob's work focuses on changing people's fundamental relationship to land and housing. He works with social movements all around the world. In the United States, he works with communities on a range of social justice issues, including poverty and debt, police violence against the poor, gentrification, and access to broadband. In the fall of 2009, Rob was chosen to be the New York City chairperson for the first ever official mission to the US of a UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. He was a member of the advance team coordinated by the US Human Rights Network, an organization in which he's been involved for many years, traveled to Geneva several times to prepare for the initial appearance of the United States in the Universal Periodic Review Program, which is where the United States submits its own record for review by its peers in the UN. Rob is currently an adjunct professor of urbanism in the Design and Urban Ecology program at the New School, where he mentors students and supports their thesis projects in an architectural master's degree program called Design and Urban Ecology. So we're so privileged to have all of you with us today for this conversation. Let me just note for the audience that we will have a question and answer period once we've gotten into these issues a bit. And please feel free to submit your questions by opening the Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So those will queue up and I'll take a look and we'll weave those into the conversation as we go. So first, I wanted to ask just all of you, maybe starting with Rob, what drew you into this work in the first place? How does the relationship between poverty and human rights play out in the work that you do?
Sure. So first, Elisa, thank you and everybody at Georgetown Law for inviting me, and for the fellow panelists that I sit amongst, in particular, Kate McDonald. Kate Donald, who I've had a relationship with as she worked for a UN Special Rapporteur, of which I have a lot of interactions with current and past rapporteurs. So it's fascinating to be reconnected. So thank you for that. And I would say that for me, as I went through what I call a transformation in life, that period of being homeless on the streets in Miami, 2.5 years and 10 months in a New York City homeless shelter, I refer to as a transformation. And for me, that was, okay, the world, I was taught certain things the first part of my life, and I've experienced something different over this last 3 or 4 years that I went through this transformation. And it always fascinated people when I articulate this theory that I came upon as I was going through this transformation, and that is gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. It seemed there was a predetermined path for some people, and most of those people look like me, people of color, low income, poor people, right? And I wasn't necessarily raised poor. I had a stumble in life where I was laid off from a job where in Miami, where I thought, I would find another job, and Miami is going through tough economic times. So for me, maybe the road to escape that was a lot easier than for other people. But I realized that there were some people that were mired in this thing called homelessness. And I attributed a lot of it to long-term poverty. I attributed it to a constitution that's 400 years old, written in old language, and a constitution that guaranteed property rights over people's rights. And that's what set me off on this particular journey.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Kate, how about you? What brought you into this work, and how does the issue of poverty relate to what you do now?
Yeah, so I mean, my story's probably a lot less profound than Rob's. But I first started becoming interested in human rights more as a kind of academic, interest. I had always identified, well, ever since I can remember, I identified as a feminist, and had been quite involved in women's rights activism during my time at school and at university. And didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life when I first left university, but was involved in those kind of in that kind of political activism. And eventually I decided to go back to school, and I study, I did a master's in human rights at the LSE. And then I kind of, my focus was still on women's rights. But when I started working professionally in human rights, more and more I came up against this issue of no matter what law we have on paper, no matter what commitments that governments have made, even the best intentions are undermined by the existence of systemic poverty, of chronic poverty. And it became increasingly clear to me that we cannot realize human rights and tackle human rights without looking at economic issues. The more I worked on this issue, the more that's the kind of thing I came up against. It's okay, we're trying all these different things. We're naming and shaming states. We're calling out, the lack of access to X, Y, or Z, or we're calling out the lack of right to a fair trial. But the system in which, as Rob put it, like the system in which people are mired is the fundamental problem. And then I started working with, as Rob mentioned as well, one of the UN special rapporteurs. So those that don't know, the UN special rapporteurs are independent experts appointed by the Human Rights Council to look at a range of different issues, and some have country-focused mandates. And I started working as an advisor and researcher with one of the UN special rapporteurs whose focus was on extreme poverty and human rights. And that was an amazing introduction to this world and to this work, and also to like incredible activists and researchers and advocates around the world, like Rob and various people that I met and got to interact with from around the world, who were looking at so many different issues and how they fed into poverty and how they exacerbated poverty and how they perpetuated the cycle of poverty. And really, and then that led me to really look to kind of increase my focus on economic policies and the economic drivers of human rights violations. So I can say more as we go on, but I'll leave it there for now.
Great. And David, what about you? You come from a very particular religious tradition, and how did that lead you into this work looking at human rights and the relation with poverty? Oh, I think you're muted, David.
Sorry about that. Yes, back in the days when I was still a graduate student, there was a lot of initiatives underway about the revival of human rights around the world. And Jimmy Carter was coming into power, and Carter initiated some very important movement on U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis human rights and so forth. And so I began to get involved in this, and I decided to write my doctoral thesis on human rights issues, and coming at it from my own religious tradition. I was a student in the religious studies department at Yale University, and trying to bring forward a kind of religious approach to how we think about human rights. And looking at the Roman Catholic tradition, which is my own tradition, one of the things that's very clear is that Catholicism, on one level, had been rather slow to get involved in human rights, especially civil and political rights and rights to religious freedom and so forth. But if you go back more deeply, Catholicism was deeply engaged in promoting the rights of working people, the poor, the living wage movement. The labor movement in the United States and in many parts of the world had very strong support from the church. And as I was beginning, so the social and economic rights that are sort of part of the Universal Declaration, including the right to a living wage and the right to adequate nutrition and housing and so forth, these were the sort of things that Roman Catholicism was stressing from the beginning of its discussion of human rights. So when this began to get re-articulated back in the 70s and early 80s, when I was trying to advocate for the human rights of people who were poor and working people and so forth, people kept saying, that's communism. That's some kind of left-wing agenda. And I said, wait a minute, let me tell you where I'm coming from on this. I'm not coming from communism at all. And so it became for me a very interesting effort to try to bring what the Universal Declaration clearly says, which is that both civil and political and social and economic rights are equally on the agenda for the human rights community. But it's been a struggle to get the rights of the poor, the rights of those who are struggling to get an adequate wage, the right of those struggling to get housing. It's been more difficult to get that. And then the issue has been revitalized in some recent discussions as well. But that's where I'm coming from. And I think we can get into some discussions of that among each other as we move forward.
Right. I want to pick up on that, David, because, it's what did people say, or maybe it was Churchill who said that, Americans will always do the right thing after they've exhausted, all other possibilities. it seems like in many ways we're, the original wisdom of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and coming out of the catastrophe of World War II really saw that, the interconnectedness between these, as FDR put it, freedom from want and freedom from fear, and that whole Second Bill of Rights idea, was so strong and so profound, and then got shattered by this, Cold War phenomenon where, the world split in two, and one side didn't care about, called respect for rights like the right to housing and the right to a fair wage, communism, and the other side, prioritized supposedly those rights and violated all the others. And now we seem to be kind of coming back to a realization of, and perhaps COVID was one of the, kind of jump-started that a bit more, at least accelerated the sense in which, we are all connected, and the health and well-being of people all across the planet impacts each one of us, which is, the kernel of wisdom at the heart of the Universal Declaration. So I wondered, Rob, you've worked with, looked at this from a global perspective, but from the grassroots of people working on these issues in other countries and how they come together through the UN. I know you've been just in a bunch of meetings last week around the UN. Could you tell us a little bit about how this looks, kind of like the commonality of problems across the world, and what people are doing together about it?
Sure. Thank you, Elise. I think, so one thing that became apparent to me through this journey that I've been taken through, and working with UN mechanisms and working in communities and working through academia and even with the faith community, because, when you want to lift up your issue, morality is a great road to go down, right? So the work of Take Back the Land, that's what we used when it seemed to people like we were just taking something, but we build it as a moral issue, right? The right of a person to live in a home, it supersedes the right of a landlord or a speculator to profit off of a home. And we did it through a moral lens, and people started to think different. But I think to answer your question, I think the issue that we're going through are the same around the world, but they weren't necessarily connected. As I've started to work around the world, I saw a disconnect. And that disconnect happened because the United States presented itself as this great democracy. People received that outward message that everything was perfect here, until I was fortunate enough to travel to places like Brazil and South Africa and Colombia and Berlin, Germany, and France, all these different places I got to go to and have conversations with the grassroots community. They all of a sudden said, well, that's not what we heard. There are contradictions, Rob, with the way the US presents itself. So that cleared a space for us internationally to really sit down and talk about our struggles and connect on an international level. And probably the greatest example of that for me is a group out of Spain called La PA, the platform of people affected by mortgages in Spain. They've come to the United States several times because they are targeting Blackstone Equities, the largest owner of housing in the world, right? So to bring us together, they're situated in the United States, but they're acting all over the world. So really brought forward for us here in the United States, the economic issues that Kate touched on earlier, right? This isn't, I understood personally, from my own lived experience, the commodification of land and housing is at the root of our problem, right? But then how big is this problem? What is it? How far does it reach, right? And working with these groups around the world, you started to understand that access to water, access to sanitation are all connected, right? And they're all connected mainly through land and water, right? So it was easy to bring groups together. And I think we still have some trouble here in the US, as David mentioned, when people don't necessarily accept human rights, even, and I always find this unusual in the African-American community, where they still will use terms like communism and say that's problematic. But I have seen a shift. I have to be honest and open about this, where in 2010, let's say, when I went for the Universal Periodic Review, people didn't necessarily believe in human rights. They would use the language. But now I see people in protests and rallies standing in front of City Hall saying, I have the human right to a home, and it means something to me. So I think there's been a definite shift over a period of time. And I would argue that working with international grassroots movements has done that. It's certainly done it for me. And it's helped me to understand that these problems aren't, solely to the US. These are global problems that we're facing. But I've also watched the way that those problems are interacted with outside of the US in a much more systemic and solution-based way outside of the US, which I'm trying to get people here to sort of navigate towards.
Yeah, that it's really in some ways an exciting moment because you can see the potential for great power. You have the Poor People's Campaign being revived, and maybe one of you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, at least if I could just interrupt you, that Poor People's Campaign is a barometer for me personally, because they came out of a group called the Poverty Initiative at Union Theological Seminary in New York. In 2008, I saw a film called Dear Mandela, which features the Abashali movement in South Africa. And I saw a 14-year-old Mazwi pounding his chest with a book of the South African Constitution that says, I have a human right to a home. It's written right here. And it was such a powerful moment for me. I said, that 14-year-old is pounding his chest and understanding this. Well, I can certainly understand it. So there's definitely a link there.
It's really exciting. And you can feel that movement in the United States too, which, where even with President Obama and the rhetoric around healthcare as a human right, and how, that was such a struggle within our political system to get that, the Affordable Care Act. But around that, I think we became more comfortable with the idea of thinking of healthcare as a human right when we saw the profound deprivation of basic rights of people. And now, just last month, I think, or a couple months ago, you saw HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge say out loud these words that housing rights activists have been looking for so long, that housing is a human right, which, to many ears sounds very revolutionary. But when you go back to, it's like, okay, we're 70 or 80 years past that original concept. We're finally getting it. And I think maybe we'll talk a little bit in a second about what that could mean. But Kate, I wanted to ask you, I'm reflecting on this and that great video that you all did. And I thought, when I started working on human rights as a human rights lawyer 30 something years ago, I never thought I would have to understand the tax code in order to do human rights work, but now I'm realizing so much of it is really linked to that. And when you talk about the systems that, it's not like individual violations, but we're living in kind of systems that embed and perpetuate inequality and violations of fundamental human rights. Could you talk a little bit about that and maybe take us a little further down what a rights-based economy would look like?
Sure. I'm just going to first say just a couple of words about this indivisibility issue, because I think it's so crucial and important. And I think that, in my experience, what I've seen is that activists on the ground and people who have lived experience of poverty understand this very well and very intimately, that their civil and political rights and their economic and social rights are intertwined, because it's a nonsense to them to say like, oh, but you have all these rights and all these, in theory you could do this and that. And they say, well, I can't because of this situation that I'm in. And like, what use is what use is this particular civil and political right to me if I can't put food on the table, or if I can't pay my rent? There's no real rights enjoyment without the other. And I think that
if I could just
sure.
On that point before you move on, it's even worse than that. My colleague at the Law Center, Peter Edelman, has written about, the criminalization of poverty. So it's not just the inability to enjoy rights, but in fact, then the criminalization of being poor, that
Yes.
These things are interlocked in such a way that, not only can you not, exercise your civil and political rights, your right to vote, all of these things, but you end up incarcerated because, you don't have money. Could you say just a couple words about that?
And we did, when I worked with the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty, Magdalena Sepulveda, we did a report on the criminalization of poverty, and actually, we did research and we spoke to civil society organizations and activists around the world, and the US was one of the worst places for this, in terms of the types of penalization and criminalization that people come up against, particularly the homeless population, worst impacted. Thinking about vagrancy laws, panhandling laws, like public urination laws. It's like when, of course, there's no actual toilets provided for homeless people. So what are they meant to do? So the way in which this then and then you see this vicious circle of then they enter the justice system, and then fines are levied, they can't pay the fines, and therefore the fines triple, and then they're incarcerated, and so this absolute vicious circle of how the system which is meant to protect civil and political rights, and the system which in theory should protect social and economic rights, is just the failure keeps on going on, and there's really no escape for people. We really did, it was shocking, but we really did find that the US was, and I say shocking, I live here now, so now I wouldn't be shocked maybe to find that, but at the time I didn't live in the US, and to me it was really shocking to find the extent to which poverty and the behaviors that are necessitated by living in poverty are penalized and criminalized in the US. So, and I would say as well that I think that this issue of indivisibility is really well understood as well by activists in other countries as well. I mean, I see, for example, we work with partners in Egypt, and Egypt is, of course, very unfortunately infamous for the repression of civil and political rights, which has been happening in recent years. But when we're talking with our partners and activists in Egypt, they see the social and economic repression that they're experiencing as intimately intertwined with the jailing of so-called dissidents and human rights defenders. Poverty in Egypt has actually skyrocketed, even pre-COVID, has gone up in recent years. There've been a series of kind of economic austerity type economic reforms that have really impacted especially women particularly badly. And then in reaction to that, the protests against those kind of measures get criminalized and people get thrown in jail. So it's very clear and obvious to them that it seems it's such an academic and false distinction that we have this debate around economic and social rights and civil and political rights. Maybe should I just say a few words now about the rights-based economy, Elisa, before so the rights-based economy idea, I mean, as you said, I when I got into human rights work, I also never thought that I would be thinking about tax codes. But actually, again, it was through my work with the UN Special Rapporteur that I started thinking about tax policy. We did a report on tax policy and how it affects human rights, and especially the human rights of people living in poverty. And what I have to admit, when we first started it, I was dreading it. I was thinking, oh my God, tax, I can't think of anything more boring. And then I became I was really converted. I'm now a real evangelist for the importance of thinking about tax policy and pushing for reform of tax policy. So, the fundamental kind of question is, are our economic policy, tax policies and our economic policies more broadly, are they helping to lift people out of poverty, or are they trapping people in a cycle of poverty? Are they redistributing income, wealth, and power, or are they entrenching income, wealth, and power in a smaller and smaller segment of the population? And we can see it, for example, through COVID. The famous statistic that, of course, poverty has increased in many respects. Unemployment is now a lot better, but many people, lost their jobs. And while this was all happening, billionaires were increasing their, the likes of Jeff Bezos were increasing their wealth by billions and billions and billions. And clearly a system in which that is happening is not an economic system that is conducive to human rights realization. So that's really where the idea came about, but I'll be quiet now so others can speak.
Yeah, well, one of the things that highlights, I think, is that, I remember, for years leading a human rights organization and working with a lot of donors, that, the perspective of many of them was, you guys should stay away from the political stuff because, human rights is kind of sacrosanct. It's like, it's kind of a religion of its own. And, you should be inside the monastery in a way and be talking about these lofty ideals and, don't get involved in that messy stuff of politics. But it's, it's quite clear that, politics and the rough and tumble is where rights get enforced or don't. And that's where the real battle is. And David, that was really, I think, emphasized to me during the previous US administration, where, there were a lot of folks who knew that the human rights policies of the previous administration were going to be bad and all of that. But actually the previous administration seized on the idea of human rights, saw it in a way as a threat, and sought to embrace it and redefine it, through this Pompeo Commission on Inalienable Rights, which,
Right.
Really in a quite brilliantly toxic way sought to, the attitude was people are talking about too many rights. What is this? Housing and, food and all this. We need to get back to basics. And the basics were freedom of religion, the so-called first freedom in the United States, and property rights. That those were the key rights, and sought to really retell the story of of human rights through the lens of this very specific vision of an economy that is, as Kate just outlined and Rob talked about, kind of the source of a lot of the violations. So what do you think about that, and what's the role of religion and religious?
Right. Well, that's a great example. I mean, the stress on freedom of religion and the right to private property and so forth coming out of the Pompeo Commission and so forth fits right in with this idea that there's a very narrow range of issues that are important on the human rights agenda, and that it doesn't include the social and economic and cultural rights that are already part of the Universal Declaration. I'm certainly in favor, strongly, of civil and political rights. I'm in favor of the right to freedom of religion. I'm in favor of protecting people's ownership of property, although not unlimited property by a long shot. I want to state I have a very strong view on the necessary limits on private property ownership and so forth. But maybe I could build upon something that Rob said a little earlier. He was citing the example of the young person in South Africa pounding the South African Constitution on her chest and saying that I have a right to housing, which is true. That's in the South African Constitution. But we have a tendency, I think, when we think about South Africa in relation to human rights, to celebrate the achievement that South Africa reached by getting rid of the apartheid regime, of finally allowing people to vote no matter what the color of their skin. And that is a very important achievement. But sad to say, the realities of poverty and homelessness and so forth in South Africa have not been resolved by a long shot. You've still got a sizable percentage of South African people very, very desperately poor. And when South Africa used to be the most unequal country in economic distribution in the world. It's still very unequal. I don't know whether it's the most equal anymore, but it's very unequal. But bringing this to the fore, when we look, say, at the African situation today, more than half the very desperately poor people in the world today live in Africa. The extreme poverty is defined by the World Bank as living on less than $1.90 a day. And Kate has been deeply involved in all of this, I'm sure. But we've seen a notable decline in the amount of extreme poverty in the world, which is very much to be celebrated. And what it points to, I cite this with my students, that we've moved from about a third of the world's population living in extreme poverty to about a little under 10%. That's roughly the rough figures. So it's been a sizable achievement. And the reason I cite it with my students is it shows that we can actually do something about this if we decide to try to do it. And in certain parts of the world, it's happened. We're moving in the right direction. But in Africa, we're moving in the wrong direction. Sub-Saharan Africa, the inequality is growing. The amount of poverty, extreme poverty in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, is growing. And we've got to take steps to deal with that. And that means putting the rights that are in the South African Constitution, putting them on the agenda for action. Not just say, well, we have major initiatives around the world to try to bring South Africa's apartheid regime to an end. The students on many campuses in this country and in other parts of the world were deeply engaged in trying to say, let's get rid of apartheid. And what we need is something similar to that, it seems to me, to say we need to address the extreme poverty that still exists in the world, in that we've got multiple tens of millions of people living in extreme poverty around the world today. And to try to really push that would go in the opposite direction from the Pompeo Commission. And because if we could say there's more to this human rights agenda than private property ownership for the rich, that's for sure. And there's more to it than civil and political rights, including the right to religious freedom, which I'm all for. And I'm all for people having a vote, just as like I would one of the people in the Black people and the colored people in South Africa to get a vote when they were under apartheid. But that's not enough. And that goes back to what Kate was saying about the interconnection, the indivisibility of these human rights. They're all woven together. And I think you could probably make a case that some of the continuing poverty in South Africa is largely due to corruption, which means we need to address the political side of this as well as the economic side of it, and to try to find ways to deal with these human rights in an indivisible and interconnected way, it seems to me, is really crucial for our time. And finding ways to really press that with a kind of more vigorous campaign is, I think, what we really need right today.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to you on that, David, about the role of faith communities in that agenda. But
sure, okay.
I know you've done some work on this issue in South Africa. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'd love to react to 2 points that David made. One around the extreme poverty line, and one around South Africa in particular. So, as many of you listening here will know, there's kind of been a big debate among academics around the kind of appropriate measurement of poverty and extreme poverty. Right. As David said, the World Bank's kind of official measure is $1.90 a day currently. It was $1 a day for a while. Now it's $1.90 a day. And yes, thankfully, and it is certainly an achievement to celebrate, the number of people living and the proportion of people living in extreme poverty in the world has declined significantly in recent years. However, by other measures, when you're looking, and $1.90 a day is in many contexts a fairly ludicrous measure. I think probably most of us could agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's really like incredibly desperate poverty in most contexts. And if you look at kind of what some academics have identified as more kind of adequate poverty lines, which actually would allow for like basic, the sufficient, basket of goods that you would need to kind of lead a dignified life, that actually there's been very little, if any, reduction in, so we're looking more like in the kind of like $5 to $8 a day range. Still sounds very little to people in this country, I know. Then actually poverty has been quite stagnant. And you can kind of put the blame for that at the door of a number of different kind of policies and issues, but including around kind of and part of it is to do with this issue of we've been kind of tinkering around the edges, and we've been trying to tackle the symptoms of poverty rather than trying to tackle the root causes. That's there's obviously a much more complex argument that you could go into, but I'll leave it at that. On the issue of South Africa, yeah, we've done some work with we have some very good partners in South Africa called the Institute for Economic Justice and Section 27 on economic and social rights in South Africa. And yeah, I mean, I think by some measures, South Africa is still the most unequal country in the world. And we were talking about access to land earlier. I mean, the land inequality in South Africa is actually absolutely obscene, and of course, it's on wealth, but also racial lines. So I think still something like 70% of the land in South Africa is owned by white people, which is just obscene to think about. And some of you may know South Africa is in a very lengthy and difficult process to try and act on redistribution of land. But also wealth inequality it's one of the most unequal countries in the world too, and again very much on racial and gender lines, I'd like to say, because we all know that inequalities are intersecting. So in particular, Black women are very mired in poverty, and there's huge racial and gender wealth gaps in South Africa. And one of the big issues that we found in our research with our partners, and we actually presented this to the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights a few years ago as part of South Africa's first review by the committee, we found that the root causes and the drivers of this extreme inequality and poverty that persists in South Africa, corruption is certainly a factor. But we also found that the kind of economic path that South Africa has pursued was a major cause of the kind of inequality and poverty that really persists in South Africa. And in particular, South Africa, in partly to please kind of international markets, in part to please donor countries, and in part just due to the kind of ideological influence of this idea of kind of neoliberal trickle down economics, has really put in place these very like classical neoliberal policies, these ideas of kind of, trickle down, and not really tackled the systemic drivers of inequality in the country. And even in recent years has pursued a kind of austerity type kind of economic program, which is really actually, so for example, budgets for health and education have gone down in real terms in recent years, even pre-COVID in South Africa, which is really shocking to think about in a country where those rights are indeed in the Constitution.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the gender dynamic there, Kate, because I've been reading about the women, peace and security agenda, and the way in which the global pandemic has set back the enjoyment of rights for women who disproportionately have been at the front lines of dealing with the pandemic, whether it's with the impact of kids at home, the lack of childcare, the caregiving responsibilities, and the inability to manage to do all of that, take on all those responsibilities and maintain employment, has set back that agenda, probably by a decade. When I listen to the complex and interlocking nature of these problems, it can be sort of overwhelming to think about, where do you pull the thread, and how, where do you even come at this? And, I know that I've had conversations with people in government where I'm talking about the importance of a human rights framework. And, and the question I often get asked is, what difference does it make what we call it? And I try to, explain the power of the human rights framework. But I think I'd love to hear from each one of you. When I said Secretary Fudge said housing is a human right. Okay, so it didn't mean that overnight, everybody was able to enjoy the right to be housed. So what is the power of the human rights framework when we're trying to tackle this, very complex and entrenched problem of poverty? Rob, maybe you could start with that.
Sure. And thank you. I think this is the deep part because this is some work I'm involved now. So for me, it starts with education. I mentioned early on through my talks that I think we have this exceptionalist attitude here in the US with respect to human rights. But you read one of my favorite articles, article number 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this little pocket book goes everywhere I do. And it could be at a rally, it could be at City Hall, it could be having a conversation with people. And I'll often start off with article number 25. And what does that mean to you? So for me, I think it's problematic that we are proud to say as a country that Eleanor Roosevelt helped create the founding document of the UN. However, I never learned about it in school, Elisa, so are we ashamed of it? So now's my opportunity to get in front of elected officials and say, well, what about this? How come this isn't part of the curriculum? And, speaking of rapporteurs, I'm blessed. I found out from Raquel Ronig's visit here what the power of having relationships with these UN mechanisms can do for you. So I built a beautiful relationship with Leilani Farhad, the former UN Special Rapporteur. She followed Raquel and she did 2 mandates, and now it's Balakrishnan and Rajagopal. But Leilani started an organization she calls Make the Shift, right? Let's shift from talking about the right to housing to making it a reality. And it's a path that we have to go on. And what she is doing, I think that's fascinating. She's allowed me to sit on some of these conversations, is having conversations with elected and appointed officials in Canada from the local to the federal to really discuss what this means, right? I think we often stand behind the shroud of our Constitution. And as I like to say, the black robes in the court, right? When I talk to young lawyers, I often say to them, you need to challenge those black robes in there. Dare a judge when you go in to argue a case on housing or a mortgage foreclosure to say that this client has the human right to housing. Use those arguments. I dare a judge to go on record with the stenographer in there to say, you don't have that human right. It's not good. The worst he's going to say, or she's going to say, is go in the back and see if you can negotiate a deal. Well, that's fine. It slows down the process. So for me, I think it's education is a big part of it. So Leilani is working with me, and we're working with Pittsburgh, Dayton, Ohio, and New York City to do the same type of tour, to bring together elected and appointed officials to have a very open conversation about what human rights means, and in particular, the human right to housing. Because if you are not housed stably, nothing is going to work, right? So it starts with housing, a secure, affordable, dignified place to live. And I think every city in America is struggling from that. So education on human rights is a big part of it, and how that framework fits inside of our law or doesn't fit inside of our law, and will lift up the problems of US law that doesn't allow human rights to take precedent. So you're saying I can't meet people's needs because of the civil framework of our Constitution? Then we have a problem with our Constitution. Let's admit it. Let's be real, and let's think about some adjustments. I just want to quickly say one more thing on South Africa. I don't want to fantasize about South Africa, but I think you're at a different place when you have a document like a constitution in South Africa, and you can make arguments that it's written right here, it's written somewhere. right? As opposed to us, where there's nothing about human rights in our argument. And we've seen that play out in the High Court in South Africa, where Abashali based Monjondolo, which is a group that I have a strong tie to, has won some serious fights around that. Now, life isn't perfect. David is absolutely right. The realization is something else. But what they have done a great job in is reaching out to the rest of the world for support. And I'm constantly in the ear of the High Commissioner's office in the UN from New York, telling them what's going on in South Africa, and you need to intercede. So, I think that's, for me, that's what it's about. Education is a big part of it, and getting people to understand that human rights does mean something. It's more than an abstract thing that's out there or outside of the US. And I'm speaking from the US because I don't think the problem in other countries is the same. There are groups that, like maybe a UCLG, and I think Kate would be familiar with United Cities Local Governments, which has been bringing governments to conversations like the one Leilani wants to do, but we've been somewhat resistant here in the US.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that about the enforcement and the difference, what difference it makes to have these rights, acknowledged and ensured in a constitution. We're getting some fantastic questions in the Q&A, so we're gonna soon go there. But I wanna give David and then Kate an opportunity to weigh in on this question about the rights framework and what difference it makes.
Well, I could say something about that. I mean, one of the definitions of human rights that means a lot to me is something that you mentioned earlier about my work with the U.S. bishops on a document they produced called Economic Justice for All, which goes back some time ago. But they define human rights in that document as the minimum conditions for life in community. And you could also put it to say they're the minimum requirements of human dignity. But the stress of that definition that says it's the minimum conditions for life in community is all about the fact that protecting human dignity is about being part of a community, not being excluded, not being left out, not being marginalized, being part of what's going on. And if you can make a claim that a person has a right to be actively engaged in the life of the community, that cuts across the full range of human rights. It means they have a right to be an influence in their government. They ought to be not just told what to do all the time, but also it means they have a right to get a job. There ought to be some access to work. There ought to be access to being able to share in the nutrition that's available in the society. There should be an access to or participation in the healthcare system so that people have so that I like to think of the violation of human rights as primarily a form of exclusion or of people being left out or actively excluded from being part of what we're doing together. And if we can make a claim like that, that means this responsibility to protect these rights falls on us as a group. We have to take action, to take policies, to structure institutions, to prepare policies that are going to carry us toward responding to the fact that there are far too many people that are homeless right here in Washington, D.C. You can walk around Georgetown and see people sleeping in tents on the streets. And Georgetown is a rich neighborhood, but there are plenty of people in tents right around the corner from where we are, right where I'm sitting right now. And you'll find them in some places, they don't even have a tent. But this is a sort of, so you can look at the inequalities that are growing, they're not just unequal distributions of money, but they're fragmentations of community. They break down the unity that should bind us together as brothers and sisters. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has a very interesting statement, it seems to me, that when it declares in Article 1, it says, All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And then it goes on and it says, they should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood or sisterhood, or I would prefer the language solidarity. We should act together with each other in solidarity. We're part of the same community, and therefore we're having to be responsible for each other. And I think the human rights agenda can make a claim like that in a very powerful way. And that's why I think it's so important.
David, just a quick response, if I could.
Yes, please.
One of the reasons why I love to work with the faith community is because I believe we're somewhat complicit in our own problems, that we don't adhere to those standards, David. We don't act as a community.
I agree with you.
We're quite selfish as a society in the US, and that gets in the way of doing that. And then just to add to you, I'm somebody who mentioned at the top of this that I've slept on the streets and slept in the shelter. I came down for an interview at Al Jazeera about a month ago, and I was stunned to walk outside in front of Union Station and see the tents pitch. I'm like, oh, yeah. It didn't improve. It got worse because they used to be along the post office ledge. Now they've pinched tents, right? That's the answer. Let them sleep in tents. So we have a problem as a society, right?
Yeah, we do.
We're very selfish, right?
Yeah, I think, David, that is, a profound insight in emphasizing this right to be in community. It is, as you said, Rob, in many ways, just kind of antithetical to the culture that we have right now in this country and in many countries where we think about rights as completely kind of individualistic. And I'm hopeful that the fault lines that have been exposed through the pandemic and all of that we can in some ways learn from that and use that as a springboard to operationalize this concept of rights in community. Kate, over to you.
Yeah, no, I really love what David just said, because one of the critiques of rights that I often come up against, actually from not so much from the right, let's say, or from conservative actors, but from the left or from economic justice actors who aren't necessarily kind of human rights people, is, oh, but rights are so individualistic. And and what I try and say to them, like, actually, if you look at the whole gamut of human rights, if you're looking in particular at economic and social rights, they're not individualistic. If you take a progressive interpretation, like, rights require solidarity. Like, you cannot realize one person's right to housing and not everyone else's. I mean, especially when you remember that the human rights framework is premised on equality and non-discrimination. So there's, and that's substantive equality, not just procedural equality. So there really is, like, I think it's so important that we build up and push this vision of rights in community and rights as solidarity. Just to say a couple of, this question about, why are human rights helpful? Why should we use human rights is one I get a lot too. And I think some of the arguments were expressed in the video before, but I think very briefly, I think obviously the fact that rights are there are legally binding obligations associated with human rights is really important. The fact that therefore there are accountability mechanisms attached to those claims, even if those accountability mechanisms don't always work perfectly, I think is really important. And then I think as well that we shouldn't overlook the political salience of rights. So to claim something is a right is very powerful, and we don't claim it about every, I don't claim that I have a right to drink, fancy coffee out of this mug. We don't claim it about trivial things. We claim it for things that are really fundamentally important to human dignity. And this takes me back to the point that that you made, Elisa, about the fear of that some human rights actors have of being seen as too political. And I would actually like us as human rights actors to kind of reclaim the political nature of rights. Because, I mean, of course, rights are political. Everything is political. There's no such thing as an apolitical or totally politically neutral thing. And, for years, we've been kind of sold this narrative that, the economy we have is the neutral kind of just the one right way to do it. This idea that, neoliberalism is the kind of end of history, and there is no alternative, has been very, very prominent in discourse of like economists and politicians around the world for decades. And when I come into conversation with proponents of that system, they try to paint human rights activists and economic justice activists as ideological. Oh, that all sounds nice, but you're being ideological, you're not being pragmatic. But we have to increasingly push back and say, no, I'm sorry, you're being, neoliberalism is a dogma, it is an ideology. Like the system we have is not, and I often say, poverty is not inevitable. It's a policy choice, essentially. And human rights provides us a framework to put together a different set of policies and to put together a different narrative around what it means to have a fair economy and to live in dignity. And just one final point, also coming back to something you said before, Elisa, is like, I think a really important part of that is the vision. Like, we need to be naming and shaming, we need to be critiquing what's going wrong, but we also need to be putting forward like a positive vision based on human rights of the society we want to see.
Could I add a comment, just an additional comment to build on what Kate just said, in terms of this conception of rights as being part of the community, and the critique that Kate wants to argue against the so-called neoliberal argument. Now, there's some theorists around. Now, I do a fair amount of work of reading of some of this theory about human rights today, but somebody like Samuel Moyn, who's taken very seriously in the academic world about a commentator on human rights. And he thinks that human rights are too individualistic to be able to respond to the needs of economic poverty and economic he thinks human rights are inadequate to respond to the kind of challenge of the so-called neoliberal unimpeded market economy approach. I want to argue very strongly that he's wrong in that regard, that it's the wrong way to go. And those who would want to make human rights individualistic miss the point, not only of what human rights are, but also I think someone like Moyn, who's more on the left, misses the point when he doesn't see what human rights really can contribute. It's probably due to I don't want to get into an analysis of why he says what he says, but I have some views on that, but we could get into it another time.
If I could just say one thing, and then Kate, I'm going to come to you with one last, because I really want our audience to understand the Sustainable Development Goals. And I want to ask you to explain that a little bit. And then we're going to go to these fabulous questions that we're getting. But on Moyn, David, my theory on him is that his critique is really not about the human rights framework. Well, he says it is, but I think he's wrong. I think what the place where he's right, though, and where it stings a bit is that, it is a critique of many in the human rights movement over many years who have prioritized civil and political rights. It's a field dominated by lawyers who focus only on things that, they can sue around. And we're going to talk about that because we have a question, and Rob's mentioned that enforcement issue as well. But, it is a critique about the failures of the people and the vision in parts of the primarily Western, legal, somewhat elitist human rights actors, I think. And so we should be really careful to, and I think you're hearing that there's a powerful movement with a better and different vision that uses the human rights framework, that embraces it, that arises out of it, that is addressing the failures that Moyn identifies. I just think he misattributes them to the human rights framework instead of to the folks who haven't lived up to that. Okay, so I want to make sure we get to these questions, but first, Kate, could you I mentioned in the introduction the Sustainable Development Goals, and anytime you talk about like UN documents and it sounds very wonky and it sounds very distant, I wonder if you could just give us kind of the Reader's Digest version of the Sustainable Development Goals, what they are and what they mean for the issues that we're talking about today.
Good luck, Kate.
Yes, this is a challenge. No, I will be brief. So The Sustainable Development Goals were, as many of you will know, they were agreed in 2015, and they're political commitments. They're not legally binding. They're political commitments that the member states of the United Nations agreed to reach by 2030. They followed something called the Millennium Development Goals, which were quite narrow, kind of narrowly focused on kind of, I'm oversimplifying, but quite narrowly focused on kind of extreme poverty in particular, and kind of like bringing the average up in terms of kind of, making sure that the kind of average levels of poverty improved over 15 years from 2000 to 2015. So in the run up to 2015, there was a big kind of discussion, including at civil society level, grassroots level, and at the intergovernmental level around, okay, what should replace the Millennium Development Goals? And there was a big push to make them much more holistic. So tackling not just poverty, but also inequality, being much more thorough and kind of less minimalistic about what is, what we need to see in the world by 2030 in terms of development and poverty reduction. They also have a much more multidimensional view of poverty. So it's not just about the kind of $1.90 a day limit. There's specific language about the various dimensions of poverty. There was a big political battle without going into detail, but eventually we ended up with these 17 goals that, among other things, include really important innovations like a specific target on inequality. So the goal is around reducing inequality within and between countries. So some very important targets there, as well as goals around gender equality, for example, health, education, also civil and political rights do feature in there too, which was quite unique for an exercise of this sort. In terms of the relationship of the SDGs to human rights, again, it was a bit of a political battle, unfortunately, around including kind of explicit human rights language and commitments in the goals and targets. However, the 2030 agenda, which the SDGs are part of, does specifically say that this agenda is rooted in international human rights law and commitments. So there is a strong link there. And we have seen human rights actors engaging quite a lot with the SDGs. One risk that I see is that the SDGs become the convenient and more politically salient thing that governments especially want to concentrate on because they're not legally binding, because they can be spun a bit more. And we certainly have seen a bit of that in the last few years. But I think if we use the sorry, just one last thing, and then we'll move to the questions. The other really important thing about the SDGs is that they apply to all countries. So the MDGs effectively only applied to so-called developing countries. The SDGs apply to all countries. So they apply to the US just as much as they apply to Zambia. And that is an incredibly important recognition from the international community that so-called developed countries actually have as many issues with human rights and sustainable development as poorer countries.
Great, thank you. Great job summarizing all of that. But just to pick up on that, the question about enforcement, there are several questions in the Q&A about the enforcement issue. One from David Little, but there are several that express sort of the same concept. David writes, some claim that violations of civil and political rights are easier to enforce within a standard legal framework, while enforcing economic and social rights is not as easy to accommodate in a standard legal framework. Is that right? And should we be moving more towards some framework where these economic rights are more enforceable?
So the short answer is yes. I moved away from calling myself a human rights defender to a human rights enforcer because it makes them real, right? And when people start telling me they're abstract, well, no. I have these rights. I'm going to enforce them. I'm not going to defend anything. I'm going to enforce them. I do agree with the question that was laid out. I think the U.S. has only signed and ratified 3 treaties, and I think they revolve around civil and political rights for the most part. And that's where their focus is. But I do think we need a groundswell of communities understanding this. And I'm back to education again about how powerful it can be. And just a quick example with Kate being here. So Kate worked with Magdalena Sepulveda I had been to Hungary in 2009. Magdalena came to Columbia University to give a talk. I got in the room early. I started talking about the 2009 visit of Raquel Rolnick and what I saw with respect to homelessness in Hungary during the time. And Magdalena, I guess, went back to Raquel and several other rapporteurs. 6 of them wrote a strongly worded letter to Viktor Orban, and the prime minister in Hungary, about the issues of how homeless people were being treated. And it was powerful. It raised awareness around the world. But what I saw was a community get charged up because their comrade in the US enforced something. So a group called Avaros Mindenki reached out to me directly and said to me, what did you say to the Hungarian government? I said, I didn't say anything. I just had a conversation with some powerful folks who work within the UN framework, right? And they said something to the government and we got a reaction. So naming and shaming, which has come up here a couple of times, is a process to move us in a different direction. Not going to change overnight. But it's a process that we all have to engage in. And I think we have to engage in a collaborative. Some places outside of the US are better at it than we are, right? But I still think it's engagement. We have to come together and work on it together.
Yeah, I also want to underscore that point that you made earlier, Rob, that, what is to prevent people who are in court to at least claiming those rights. The court can say, there's nothing in our Constitution, or be quiet, you don't have standing to say that. But shaping the way judges and lawyers and
start the debate. The debate has to start somewhere. And Maryland Legal Services is very successful in using this framework, right? They actually got bold enough to challenge, as I like to say, the black robes, right? That's what happens. Sometimes there's an intimidation factor when you walk into a US courtroom, right? The scales of justice, the black robes, everything is equal. Well, not so much, right? So.
Yeah. Kate, what do you think about this?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. And, I think, and this is a very common argument as well. Well, economic and social rights, the bad faith version of this argument is economic and social rights aren't real rights because they're not legally justiciable. That's not what this particular questioner is saying, but that is the argument that does get rolled out a lot. And, the answer is that certainly economic and social rights are sometimes a different beast when it comes to like proving violations and when it comes to identifying an appropriate remedy, partly because, in some cases, economic and social right, in some cases for civil and political rights, there is a kind of clear and individual remedy that can be, someone can be released from jail, or someone's right to vote can be restored. And it's not to say that those solutions are easy to arrive at in a political sense, but so to really, in order for economic and social rights to be truly legally enforceable, it does require us to rethink often, like what remedies can the legal system provide and what is an appropriate remedy? Because very clearly, when we're talking about poverty and human rights, it's not individualistic. You can't say, okay, well, I guess you could, but it wouldn't be very sufficient to say, okay, we'll give this one person more money. To tackle the human rights violations which are associated and caused by poverty, it needs a much more like systemic and structural rethink of how we're designing policy and how we're distributing resources in this country. So it requires a different type of thinking about what a remedy is, and it requires remedies to be more collective. I would also say like that there's often an idea as well that, that this is also is a downfall. So like, well, economic and social rights aren't justiciable because they require resources to address them. But that's a false distinction, because civil and political rights require resources too. Like, you don't have a right to a fair trial without a justice system that is well resourced, for example. So I really always like to, make sure that distinction isn't like falsely understood. And I would say, that there are some really examples with of really innovative and exciting economic and social rights litigation. Like actually coming back to South Africa, there was a really interesting decision by the South African Constitutional Court recently about, again, a kind of economic policy topic that I never thought I'd be engaging with, about competition law. And how, like, competition law, because of the corporate monopolies that are formed, about how competition law is really kind of affecting the economy of South Africa and really like help exacerbating poverty in South Africa. So we are seeing some really innovative kind of legal strategies and judgments starting to come out, I think.
Great, thank you. We have a series of comments in here, and I think a question from Peter Torrigiani that I'm going to ask David to address. There's a mention of Pope St. John Paul at the UN General Assembly proposing a rights of nations concept as necessary to advance human rights in 1995, and the question about the relevance of that to this conversation. Is that something that you're familiar with, David?
I'm aware of the talk that he gave, and it wasn't fully clear to me exactly what was being referred to there. I think he was basically trying to talk about the right of national groups to be respected, and I think he was. But I would have to go back and look at that document to comment on it in any greater depth. I'm not 100% sure. I think he was probably pointing toward the fact that he wanted to say that rights are not simply the rights of, say, individuals. This may have had something to do with the situation in Poland that he was very aware of, not only about the rights of people, individuals in Poland to be free from oppression, but he wanted the country of Poland to be free from oppression by what was then the Soviet Union. So that the rights of a national group to be respected, but I'm not 100% sure about that's what the questioner is referring to. But
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That may have particular relevance today in the situation with
Ukraine. Yes, indeed.
But a couple more questions, if we can fit these in. One is from John Reeder. The U.S. refundable child tax credit reduced the number of children in poverty. But that's now been, expired. This was the biggest reduction in child poverty in decades. Republicans and conservative Democrats opposed this. What are the lessons for us about poverty reduction and the political dynamic there? Kate, can you address that?
Yeah, I think this is a great example of a kind of rights perspective versus a non-rights perspective, because we were talking a little bit about US exceptionalism before, and one thing that I see as an immigrant to this country, which is certainly present in other countries, but is particularly strong in this country, is this idea of like handouts, or like the deserving versus the undeserving poor. This idea that people have to like jump through hoops to access things that in other countries are just seen as absolute rights. The idea that people should be pulling themselves up by their so-called bootstraps to get out of poverty, and that kind of any help that the government might give them is, against the American ideals of freedom or whatever it is. When, by the way, corporations receive more handouts than poor people in this country. So, we really need to reconceptualize how we think about this idea of welfare and handouts. And really, this is also one of the reasons why I think like a human rights perspective on poverty is really important, because a human rights perspective says that, there's no such thing as deserving versus undeserving poor. Everyone has a right to a dignified standard of living. The government has an obligation to take the measures necessary to lift people out of poverty and to give them the resources and support they need to do that.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a revolutionary idea, and operationalizing it requires political action. And I want to end with this last question. So think about how to, kind of in responding to it, all of you kind of wrapping this up. And again, going back to that video, which I think asks, the right question: what if things look differently, and how would we get there? This is a question from Adam Carroll. Thanks to all for your important work. In polarized social and political contexts like the United States, How can we develop an effective dialogue on human rights priorities and avoid the tribalism created by competing agendas? Many of us in the human rights movement fear compromise as a form of weakness. Keeping a global perspective, how do we come together to educate and inform both voters and policymakers to take the rights of all marginalized communities seriously? So this is really the action agenda in the political context. David, do you want to jump in first here?
Let me make one comment about that. In this country, the United States, the polarization, let's say, between white working class people who supported former President Trump versus more highly educated progressive types who are, more likely to lean Democratic. This polarization is a very dangerous one in our society, it seems to me. And part of it is coming from the fact that a book that has meant a lot to me is this book called Deaths of Desperation by Angus Deaton and Ann Case up at Princeton. And they're looking at the fact that if you are high school educated or less in the United States and white, your life expectancy is declining. The number of people in that domain who are they're dying sooner, and they're dying because of desperation. They're because of alcoholism, because of suicide, because of other kinds of drug use and so forth. What's happening, in other words, with people in that segment is they're losing hope for the future because they're excluded because they don't have enough education to move forward. And the Black community has experienced this for a long time and is still in the same position, but we're getting now white working class people in the same boat. But it's causing a rift between white working class people and more progressive people, including the Black community, that leads to people getting into racially negative attitudes and all kinds of other politically dangerous situations. It seems to me that that points to the fact that providing at least basic economic and social resources for everybody is crucial to overcoming some of the rifts that are present in our society today. And that maybe we wouldn't have so many racial incidents if some of the poor white people in this country had a little more hope. I'm not trying to excuse what's going on in terms of the racial issues, because I think they're very bad. But I am saying that this is an agenda. If we take a full approach to human rights and apply it consistently across our society, maybe we could take some steps toward overcoming some of the divisions that are already dividing us. That's a thought.
Okay. Kate, what do you say?
Yeah, I think this is a very big question. I mean, I agree with David that I think providing the social and economic basis for a life of dignity with everyone in this country is a big part of the answer. I think that the question talked about, a lot of us in the human rights movement, fear compromise, and kind of watering down of our commitments and our principles. And my take on that is, we should never trade away rights. We have to be firm on that, and we can't be, the whole point of rights is that they shouldn't be traded away. And I do think we need to stand firm against the forces that would, strip away rights, whether they be, voting rights or rights to social security, or whatever else. I ultimately believe in kind of coalition building and people power as the solution to these issues. And I think that that's long and hard work. It's certainly not a silver bullet, but I think that we can draw hope from, movements in different parts of the world, including, in the feminist movement in Latin America, for example, is always like a massive source of inspiration and hope to me. Won like lots of very important victories, in recent years, including around reproductive rights, but also some economic justice issues. And I do think that as much as it's incumbent on us in the human rights movement and people in progressive circles or people in social justice activists to really it comes back to the discussion we were having about civil and political rights and social economic rights, to really weave these issues together and help people to understand why them having a right doesn't require taking a right away from someone else. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not a trade-off. We can lift everyone up together.
Great. Okay, Rob, you're going to bring us home. I was struck by what David said, thinking back to Dr. King and right before he was killed, talking about moving from an era of civil rights to an era of human rights and bringing together, under this concept of a poor people's campaign, a powerful combination of across a racial divide, looking at class issues. And so take us home.
Yeah, I agree with those thoughts, and Kate just said it: coalition building, collaboration, working together to lift everybody up. There is a divide, as David clearly said, in this country, but that's also us buying into narratives that are forced upon us, right? I think a fundamental issue around poverty today, but it doesn't say that, we've been on a trajectory of poverty. It's been long entrenched in our country, but the loss of manufacturing jobs. So the people who had a high school education used to come right up to high school and go to work in a factory and have a good sustainable job. But then we started abusing labor overseas, right? And so I think, we've gotten the child care credit was a way to lift some people out. We've given stimulus checks. I didn't necessarily need one, but I got a couple of them. If we rethink how we distribute that, Nordic countries do it. If the poverty level is 16,000 and your family only brings in 12, here's $4,000. Not so hard to do, right? Think outside of the box. But then this question of who's deserving, who, becomes a debate, and it polarizes us. I fundamentally, I think we have to change the economic system. It has to change. It's not going to change overnight. But I'm proud to say that, I'm getting people like the Marxist theory, David Harvey, to start to look at me when I sit in an audience and say, like Rob says, we need more human rights struggles in here, right? And there's a guy who everybody said, this guy's off the wall thinking about Marxism. But he's quoting me, this guy is standing on stage quoting me. So people are thinking different, right? But I think that the fundamental economic system that we live on is the huge part of the problem, right? Kate said it so clearly. When we give corporations tax rates, we put corporations over people. That's our fundamental problem. We have to think outside of the box and think differently. So,
Yeah.
Until we do that, we're going to struggle.
Well, that is what this new series from the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs is all about: rethinking religion and human rights. I think this first installation was a wild success. I learned so much from all of you. Thank you all for joining us in the audience. Thank you to our distinguished speakers, and stay tuned for what's next. Have a great.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Great to talk to you.